All right, let's get going. Bow with me. Our Holy Father in heaven, we are thankful to gather together with your people again tonight. Lord, we find these midweek Bible studies a time for refreshing, and Lord, we do ask that you will help us to be able to come in here tonight and to be reminded of just what a great God you are, to be reminded of what our mission is, and to be reminded that we're not in this life alone, that we have one another to kind of hold each other up and encourage one another. Lord, some of us need a lot of encouragement because of different circumstances and situations, and Lord, use us all as instruments to provide that encouragement. But Lord, help us to all walk, to leave here tonight feeling a little stronger and a little more emboldened to go out and do your work. We thank you, Lord, for the great opportunities you put in our path. Help us to always seek to take advantage of those opportunities in ways that honor you. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, so we are still in the book of Acts. So go ahead and open up to chapter 27 is actually where we will be tonight. Acts chapter 27. So I'm kind of skipping over a little bit all of the trials of Paul that you see in those later chapters. And one of the reasons for that is I feel like we actually already covered. Oh, that screen's not on. So we've already covered those in the sermons that we did. At least I think we did. Kind of trying to go off of memory. And so I still want to focus in on the cultural aspects. And so that section is pretty long, going through those trials and all the conversations that happen through them. So we kind of talked about the story. We didn't necessarily dig into the actual defenses that Paul made, and maybe we'll have time to do that before the end of the quarter. But I do want to dig into, again, another cultural aspect, which is ship travel. That's kind of one of those interesting things we don't often think about. I am not working, and the back screen isn't on. I don't know. So, there we go. Yeah. So here is the last journey that we have in Scripture of Paul. Now, we do think, according to tradition, that Paul was able to get set free from the first trial, and there was more journeying that Paul did, and then he gets rearrested and then executed based on the rearrest. That is the way traditionally he is presented, or his story is presented. But in the biblical story, it kind of ends with him going on this journey over to Rome, and then it ends with him in house arrest in Rome. So this is our last biblical journey that we have of Paul. And so you have him coming out of Jerusalem. He got taken from Jerusalem up to Caesarea. That was during the trial section. And then from Caesarea, chapter 27 tells us he goes from Caesarea to all these different places. They grabbed a ship, he sailed, and then you've got all of these happenings during the ship travel and things like that. So basically you have him setting out. They find an Alexandrian ship, which we'll talk about in just a moment, what that would have been like. You'll notice on the map, they tend to hug the land. That's on purpose. They didn't have GPS and all those kind of things, so they would oftentimes travel inside of land, far enough away not to be at risk of running aground, but they would travel where they could see the land, or travel in a way where they could get to the land if they needed to. Dallas? Yeah, so, if you could stay within sight of land, you were much safer doing that. So what's interesting is, do y'all remember what kind of ship I said they were on? It's Alexandrian. Where's Alexandria? Egypt, okay? So if you'll notice, we don't have the beginning of this particular ship's voyage, but if you can imagine, it came from Egypt, because it's Alexandrian. It goes from Egypt. Why is it in Caesarea? Trade. But again, it travels to land. Wouldn't it be a lot quicker to just go straight across the sea? Not if you got lost. And nobody wants to get lost. And so that was just the way they would do it. They would kind of hug the land, and they would stop at ports along the way, and they would do their trading and all of the things that were involved. And so this ship probably, we're not told, but probably has come from Egypt. Generally, an Alexandrian ship was a grain trader. They would fill up the hold with grain, and that wasn't something that was typically grown in the Upper Roman Empire. And so they would take goods down to Alexandria and drop them off, fill it up with grain, and come back. And they would kind of just make this circle back and forth around the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And so that's essentially what you see happening here. They jumped on a ship that was on its circuit doing its job, and they from Caesarea up to Sidon, they kind of stay inside the island of Cyprus, between Cyprus and the mainland, and they keep traveling along. They keep running into trouble. We're going to point that out in just a moment from the text. And eventually they decide they're going to go. A northeaster comes down, and so they have to kind of go an out-of-the-way place. So this is not their typical route, what you see happening in the book of Acts, but they're doing it to avoid the bad weather and to keep themselves on the safe side of the land. And ultimately, in the long run, it doesn't happen. See that little zigzag going from Crete over to Sicily? That's not an accurate zigzag. That's just showing they're all over the place, right? We don't really know exactly what they're doing, other than they're fighting the wind and they're trying to get across the sea, wide open sea, which is not generally where they would travel, and get to Rome. Yes, Chris? So chapter 27, verse 6, there is the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. Yeah, so it is possible I made it up. Let's be honest. Yeah, the second ship there. Yep. So again, that's the basic premise of the story. It is a somewhat quite an adventure story right here at the end of the book of Acts, which I love because it's a piece of the story that we don't often study. And one of the reasons for that is we've spent so much time on the first half of the book that we kind of have to rush through the end of the book. And so we say, he had all these trials, and then he ended up in Rome, and that's where it ended. Okay, the quarter's over. Like that's the way we normally handle the book of Acts, because at that point, we've been in the book of Acts for a long time, and we're ready to move on to something else. But here, at the end of the book of Acts, you've got this great adventure story that is very, honestly, what I love about it is it emphasizes the role of God. And that's what I love. God, they're having all this tragedy, but the tragedy is entirely within the hands and the control of God. God is directing this whole thing. And that is very powerfully stated through this whole story. So again, just to kind of give you an idea of where we got left to go in this quarter, we've got ship travel tonight. City of Rome, we're going to start into Sunday. I don't know that we'll finish that in one class. And then we'll move into some lessons learned for the rest of the month. So Paul was on an Alexandrian ship. We already pointed that out there. Excuse me, that's supposed to be verse 6, not verse 5. This is, again, all we know is it's an Alexandrian ship. The assumption is, because typically these ships were called grain traders, that it is an Alexandrian grain trader. And those ships were quite large. Some estimate that they could hold around 40, trying to make sure I'm not exaggerating this. I think it's either 40 tons or 400 tons worth of goods on them. They really could hold a ton of weight. And you get a sense of that when you read this quote, what a size the ship was. This is a quote from should have written it down. It's an ancient quote from the first century. What a size the ship was. 180 feet in length, the ship's carpenter told me. The beam more than a quarter of that, and 44 feet from the deck to the lowest point in the hold. So again, just stop right there. It has got the depth of a 4-story building. And just to kind of give you an idea. We tend to, when we think of these ancient ships, we think of the fishing vessels, which were like a really large rowboat. That's not what Paul is on here. More than likely it's something very large. One of the reasons we know it's very large is how many people do we know is on this boat? There's a bunch of them. Anybody remember? Later in chapter 27, verse 37, in all there were 276 of us on the ship. And it's not a passenger ship. I mean, this is a cargo ship. And likely, we know it was full of cargo because what did they throw overboard? All the grain and the cargo. It mentions grain specifically. And so these ships were very large. And the height of the mast and what a yard it carried and what a forestay they had to use to hold it up. So they're, very large mast. The yard meaning the sail. It has a massive sail on it. And it had all these ropes in place to hold the mast up. Like it's a very large ship. Everything was incredible. The rest of the decoration, the paintings, the red topsail, even more, the anchors with their capstans and winches, and the captain's aft. The crew was like an army. So, I mean, it's just, I want you to understand, this isn't a small fishing vessel. This is a very large ship, a very deep ship. You want to know why? When they measured the sea before a shipwreck, they first measured and they came up with 120 feet deep. The second measurement they took was 90 feet deep, and they started freaking out. We're going to run aground. We've got 90 feet, But when you've got that deep of a ship, that's a big deal. You get into that shallow of sea, you can have rocks, large rocks in the sea that are jutting up, and you can have some pretty big issues to deal with. So again, this is a very large ship. It is something that, again, it was a commercial vehicle. It was not a passenger vehicle. So to have 276 people aboard and an entire ship hold of cargo, this is a lot. So this is one artist rendition of what these ships were like based on what we found, mainly pictures. We don't actually find old Alexandrian ships anywhere. There is, to be honest, in my research, I couldn't tell if it was a replica of what they had found or if it's just a replica of what we think it was like. But they have kind of recreated these ships for the sake of, us seeing what these things were like. But as a whole, you don't find these on the bottom of the sea. They're not down there. They've completely rotted away at this point. But they are, you look at that picture and you're like, oh, that's not that big. It's got one big sail on top, no big deal. That sail is ginormous. I mean, it is a very large ship. And to think about, I would imagine it goes even much deeper than what you see there, being that it is a 4-story tall ship from deck to bottom of the boat. Yes, Dallas? Yeah. I mean, you depended entirely on the weather. You just waited on the weather to be right. And when the weather wasn't right, you know what you did? You brought your sails down and you waited. I mean, that's what you did. The ship's too big to really row. And so it's not something that, you didn't have all the rowing holes on the side of the ship and all that kind of stuff. I mean, you waited. You waited until conditions were favorable. And you see that in the story here in chapter 27, that when they were in the storm, they essentially just waited. Like there wasn't really anything they could do. And so again, you kind of see the way all that worked. Ships, it's interesting in the story, chapter 27, as they're throwing things out, one of the things that they throw out are the anchors. You know, a lot of our ships today will have one anchor. You know, a very large winched anchor on a ginormous chain that goes out. The way that they would anchor their ships is they would have multiple anchors of varying lengths. Generally, it was some sort of very heavy weight on the end of a large rope, and you would lose anchors all the time. Like that, your rope would break. So you would have more than one anchor. So anchors would be large stones that you could shove over the edge of the ship. They would be made of iron, or they found some lead anchors on the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. But that kind of gives you, and according to ancient writings, you know, they would have 14, 20 anchors on their ship, like a lot, you know. And we all look at that and go, well, that's superfluous. Like, why do you need that many? Because you lose them, right? I mean, their ropes were not the same as our chains and things like that that they would often use. There's also an interesting detail in the book of Acts. If you look at the story here, they are, so they have the skiff, talks about them running ropes around the ship. Where's that at? 40? Is it that late? No, that's cutting anchors. Do what? 17, yeah, maybe. They hoisted up, used ropes and tackle, and girded the ship. Yes. So that's interesting because that was not normal. Right? That is not a normal practice. The way these ships were put together, you did not generally plan for them to come apart. Like that's not the general way that this would go. But it's interesting here, the way they do this, they hoisted it up, the skiff, and then they used ropes and tackle, and they essentially wrapped the ship, ran ropes around the ship in order to kind of hold it all together. That gives you an idea of how severe the conditions are that they're in, that they are worried about the whole ship just coming apart. And so they're doing everything they can to hold this thing together so that they don't all die. So again, I thought that was interesting. It's an interesting detail because it was not a typical detail the way ship travel would work back then. Ships were, again, designed for storage and designed for transport. Often, as we said, it was between the Nile and the Roman Empire. They were bringing grain up, they were taking goods down, and it was just kind of the exchange of goods within the empire. And again, they would, if needed, passengers could sign on as shipmates. You generally were not going to sign on and do nothing. Like you didn't have executive quarters or first class seats in these ships. You signed on and you did work. You helped out. You would do, kind of simple work. You wouldn't necessarily hoist the sails, but you could swab the deck, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing they would do. And then prisoners, they would often, this was an easy way to transport prisoners. You know why? You can't escape. Like, you put the prisoners on there, and someone like Paul, he's not going to escape, right? Like, he's not dangerous, but he's going to court, but he's not going to escape. He's kind of trapped, and so we can give him some freedom and let him do some work, and that's kind of the way oftentimes that would work. Because you do notice in the story, Paul's not chained up in the hold of the ship, is he? He's talking to people. He has some freedom there, and that is not uncommon in these arrangements. Pen? Not necessarily. I mean, it was just an easy way to transport prisoners. You transport prisoners over land, and you have to keep them guarded at all times. You transport them on the sea, you can put them to work and That's a lot easier. So again, I would imagine, depending on what the crime or the issue is, they would get treated differently than other prisoners. But there's not really a lot of information about what all the rules were regarding prisoner transport. Again, ships, it would also be decorated typically for the gods. They would generally have some sort of statue or figurehead that was attached to the ship. That's not the way we often picture it, and actually on the front of the boat leaning out like it's part of that. It would generally be a statue that was mounted on the deck. So if you go back to our picture we were looking at, notice right there on the deck you've got that swan's head right there. That is the way it would typically go. Notice when they grab the boat from the island of Crete to go on, what does it notice about that boat? This is near the end of the over chapter 28, verse 11. After 3 months, we set sail in an Alexandrian ship, again, that had wintered at the island with the twin gods as its figurehead. So, again, what do you think typically the statue is going to look like or represent? The gods, right? I mean, you go through the ancient world, what did they make statues of? The gods. So again, one of the reasons I point that out is I don't know that we always have an appreciation for just how hard it is to escape paganism in the ancient world. You can't even get on a ship without having a idol right there that everybody has to work around and give tribute to. Like that's just everywhere you go, every city you go in, what have we noticed about them? They have temples, they have statues everywhere. There is a constant reminder that we serve the gods, we worship the gods. And so everywhere Paul goes, so even here on this boat, where Paul is still clearly representing God, he's still trying to bring people to God, he's still talking to people about God, there's still a representation of pagan gods on the boat. And so it's just kind of interesting to see that being just, you just can't escape it. That's going to be your life. Yes? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So now the boat got ruined, but Paul's God guaranteed they would make it, and they all did. So, and again, I think that has a role to play in his effectiveness on Malta and the people he was able to talk to. So I think you're absolutely right there. And again, all this makes sense. I mean, if you understand the way pagan thought worked, there was a god of the sea. There was a god of the weather. There was a god of commerce. There was the gods to protect. So you find a god you want to pay tribute to, you want to protect you. You treat that god well, that god treats you well. And so you put a figurehead of that god up on your boat, and that god will protect your boat and get you where you're supposed to be. So that is generally the way this would be thought of. So again, we've already talked about this briefly, but you've got the way that they would go through their particular journey. They would, Marshall? Who? Yeah. So it makes sense, right? And again, the gods that would be represented on these boats would be the gods of the sea, the gods of protection, those types of things. So all of that is right in line with the way that pagan people would have been thinking. So again, we've already talked about the actual voyage, that they would kind of travel in sight of land. They would make sure that they weren't going to get lost that way. Another reason they would do that is because storms do come up quickly, and it is always nice to have the protection of the land. They would always try to ride on the leeward side of the land, meaning they would always travel in a way that the weather was pushing them toward the land, not away from the land. Why do you think that is? If you got to put your sail down, you don't want to be pushed out into sea. You would rather be pushed toward the land, because then you can survive that. And so it actually mentioned why they traveled on the outside of Crete. You know, they were traveling on the leeward side of the island based on the way the wind was blowing, and so that kind of helps you understand the way that worked. So again, we've already mentioned this. Ship travel would be based on weather. Good weather, or really it's more wind than anything. Right wind gives you a good trip, gets you along your way, puts a nice push to your sail. You're able to get where you want to get to and get there in record time, right? That's what you want. That's the ideal. Bad wind made for a very long trip, okay? Because you either have to fight against the wind, which, as Dallas pointed out, these ships weren't really made for that, or you just put down the sail and you wait. And the longer you wait, the more difficult the trip becomes, because you got 267 people aboard and most of your hold is holding cargo. You don't plan for that much extra food, right? I mean, you plan what would be typical, what you would wait for. You get storms on the Mediterranean Sea and you have a very dangerous trip. And so what's interesting as you look through chapter 27, look at these verses with me, because they kind of tell the story of the way this trip went. Okay, verse 4, when we had put out to sea from there, we sailed along the northern coast of Cyprus because the winds were against us. Okay, verse 7 and 8, sailing slowly for many days with difficulty, we arrived off Cnidus. Since the wind did not allow us to approach it, we sailed along the south side of Crete off Salmone. Not even sure how to say that. Verse 9, with still more difficulty, we sailed along the coast and came to a place called Fair Haven near the city of Lasea. Skip down to verse 12. Since the harbor was unsuitable for wintering in, the majority decided to set sail from there, hoping somehow to reach Phoenix, a harbor on Crete facing the southwest and northwest, and to winter there. So their goal was get to the next place on Crete, down on the far end. It would set them up for a good continuing journey. Verse 18, because we were being severely battered by the storm, they began to jettison the cargo the next day. Verse 20, for many days neither sun nor stars appeared, and the severe storm kept raging. Finally, all hope was fading that we would be saved. So things went from okay to difficult to bad to this is a disaster to we're all going to die. Like that's the way this trip goes. And that, again, as we've tried to point out, that's how ship travel went in these days. One of the reasons it went that bad is because it points out in this narrative, it was getting too late in the year to where it was not ship traveling time. Because there were whole months when you did not go out on a boat in the Mediterranean Sea because you did not have the ability to fight against the wind. Dallas? Yeah, you got no sun, you got no stars. How do you find north anymore? Right? I mean, that's bad. And when, okay, you can lose your position for a day. What do you do when you lose your position for a week? I mean, you can get real off course in a week. And the problem with that is, do what? Yeah, well, and that's what I was going to say. The problem with that is, okay, well, we don't know where we are for a week. We just camp out for a while, and as soon as the sky clears, you just get back heading north. But what if you're in a place where you've pushed into rocky region and you don't know it? Again, you got to remember how deep these ships are. If you don't know where you are and how far away land is, or how far away low spot or high spots are, and those types of things, you're in a world of trouble. And so that again is part of the difficulty here. And you got to remember again, what were these ships made out of? Wood. How hard do you have to hit a rock for you to have a problem? I mean, you don't. You don't hit a rock. That's kind of the way this goes. That's actually one of the details in the story that I find interesting, is the reason they couldn't harbor in Crete is because the southern side of Crete is very rocky. That's why they wanted to land in Fairhaven, but there wasn't really a place to winter in Fairhaven, because there wasn't a place to really put out of sea, and so they needed to get around to the other side so that they could have a harbor where you could winter in, because it depended on the lay of the land as to what you were allowed to do with your ship. When they got to Malta, what did they notice? What was the big land feature of Malta that made them go, finally? You remember? Do what? There's a beach. And so they could run their ship aground because there was a beach. It's not rocks. You can actually get your ship in place that way. And so again, that's part of this whole, we don't always understand the difficulties that went along with their traveling and with the mission that he was on, and all the things that they were dealing with. And so again, the boats would often travel along the leeward side. I also find this interesting in the story in chapter 27 particularly. Paul's traveling with some companions. You ever notice that? So he's a prisoner, but he's traveling with some companions. It mentions Aristarchus specifically, but this is one of those sections of Acts that's a we section, which makes us assume Luke is also there. So Luke is traveling with Paul. Aristarchus is traveling with Paul. Apparently the commander, the centurion Julius, likes Paul, because when you'll notice here, verse 3, the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends and receive their care. So they've landed, and Julius is like, all right, go see your buddies. It's fine. I trust you. You'll come back, right? Right? I mean, he lets Paul go. Now, maybe he sent a soldier with him. We're not given all the details here, obviously. But it is interesting, I doubt they did that with a lot of prisoners. Just go see all your friends. That's fine. Maybe he's hoping to get something himself out of this. You go get things from your friends, and maybe that would benefit him. I don't know. But it is interesting that Julius allows that. Marshall? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So maybe he's arrested too. Maybe so. Well, and it's interesting that Luke, though, we never have any record of Luke being arrested, and Luke's along too. So maybe Aristarchus is also a prisoner. Maybe that comes later. We don't know. But it is interesting to see that. So Paul's treated kindly there in verse 3. He's allowed to go visit some friends. But when you get a little bit later in the chapter, Paul gives a warning. This is verse 10 and 11. He told them, men, I can see that this voyage is headed toward disaster and heavy loss, not only of the cargo in the ship, but also of our lives. Now, I find that interesting, because what do they not lose later? Their lives. They do lose the cargo, but they don't lose their lives. So again, I don't know that this is God telling him, well, if y'all set out from here, y'all are going to lose your cargo and your lives. That's not what Paul says here. Later he says he had a message from an angel. But at this point he doesn't. I think at this point Paul's just saying, hey guys, let's not be idiots here. Like we know how this goes. This is a bad idea. Why are we setting out from here? And do they listen to it? No. So they go ahead and set out. Okay. So Paul a little later gives a prediction. Here he says, verse 21, you men should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss. Now I urge you to take courage, because there will not be any loss of lives, but only of the ship. For last night an angel of the God I belong to and serve stood by me and said, don't be afraid, Paul. It was necessary for you to appear before Caesar, and indeed God has graciously given you all those who are sailing with you. So take courage, men, because I believe God that it will be just the way it was told to me. But we have to run aground on some island. So again, Paul gives a prediction. He gives encouragement. He says, okay, this time I have an answer based on the authority of God. This isn't my advice. This is what God says. We're going to be okay. But you got to hold on. Okay? Then, starting in verse 31, he gives another warning, which is, some of the soldiers are trying to get off the ship. And he's like, no, don't let them off the ship. If they get off the ship, we're going to perish. And I love this, okay? So he says, unless these men stay on the ship, you cannot be saved. What do the soldiers do? They cut the rope to the skiff and let it fall away. They believe Paul so thoroughly at this point that they set their lifeboat out. That's impressive, isn't it? To go from, you don't know what you're talking about, to, all right, we'll get rid of our only means of escape. It's gone. We believe you. I find that to be quite the turnaround here. Dallas? This is true. Oh, man. But again, it's one of those, I do find it interesting that they're willing to trust at this point. Paul says, hey, we need to eat. What do? They eat. I mean, it's almost as if Paul has become captain of the ship at this point. I don't know that I would go that far, but he certainly is the influencer of the ship at this point. They are trusting that Paul knows what he's talking about. And even if he doesn't know what he's talking about in the details of sailing, he most definitely knows what he's talking about when it comes to what God has delivered as his will. And so they're willing to trust him that he does have answers from God and do what he says. Scott? So here, and I really don't know if this is true or not, but I'm going to throw it out there because I came across it in some of my research. If you look back in verse 13, a gentle south wind sprang up. So like Scott just pointed out, Paul said, don't go. The helmsman said, we can go. They set out, and a gentle south wind starts, and what does it say they thought? Woo! Glad we listened to those helmsmen, right? Like they clearly know what the wind's going to do. But then it says, they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. But before long, a fierce wind called a northeaster rushed down from the island. And there are some who have argued that this was not the right time of year for a northeaster, as they understood it. So this is a unseasonable type of weather that has occurred to them that is not what the helmsman would have been expecting, but Paul does say, hey, this is a bad idea, and it's almost like God's going, I'm going to prove Paul right, I don't know, because I don't understand or haven't researched thoroughly the weather patterns of the ancient world on the Mediterranean Sea. I'm a nerd, but I'm not that bad of a nerd, okay? So it's one of those, I don't know. I've come across that on a couple of different places, but it is interesting. For whatever reason, I love that through the story, the people go from trusting the sailors to trusting Paul. And I think that is remarkable because it just goes to show if you just continue to do what God tells us to do, we will have the right answers, we will do the right things, we will be proven correct, just like Paul was. I saw a couple of fingers. Dallas? Yeah. Yeah. You have all 4 seasons in one day. Yes. Yes, probably late fall. So generally, you did not do any ship travel from October through March, around that time. So people think that probably this is happening in September-ish. So they're pushing toward the October mark. And that's why they're starting to have debates about, can we do this? Can we not do this? You've got helmsmen going, all right, let's hurry along. We can get this done. We can get where we need to get to. And Paul's warning not to. So, and then when you get to chapter 27, the last part of the chapter, they get to the island. They've run aground. They've all come in, all 267 of them. And the soldiers want to do what? Kill all the prisoners. And the centurion goes, no, we're not going to kill the prisoners. And so the centurion kept them from carrying out their plan because he wanted to save Paul. We don't know how many prisoners were there. We don't know what their crimes were. But the centurion said no because he wanted to save Paul. And so he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to follow, some on planks, some on debris from the ship, and in this way, everyone safely reached the shore. But I love that you go from not heeding Paul to saving Paul's life. Like that's how far this goes over the course of this particular trip. So they end up running aground. The ship breaks apart. They all get there safely. The first story we read about is that they're all sitting around a campfire and a snake jumps out and bites Paul on the hand. And I love the way it describes it. It's just dangling there. You got a snake dangling from his hand. The islanders are this is a bad snake. And so, he's going to die. He goes from being shipwrecked, cursed by the gods, to coming to ground, and now he gets bit by a snake. He is definitely cursed by the gods, and then he doesn't die. Whoa, he is the God. That's the turnaround you get in the thought process here. And of course, then Paul does miracles on the island. There's the specific story there of him healing Publius's father. And of course, then all the other people bring their sick to Paul, and he's able to help help them to believe. It says there, verse 9, after this, the rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. So they heaped many honors on us, and when we sailed, they gave us what we needed. So what kind of feelings do you believe that the other sailors and soldiers have on Paul now? Oh, yeah. 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 No. So now you got Paul is the source of their comfort, Paul is the source of their safety, and now Paul is the source of all these blessings they're receiving from the islanders. We like Paul, right? I mean, he's pretty beneficial. I will say the second scariest moment of my life came while I was running a boat at camp, and I'll tell that story someday. I don't have time to tell it tonight, but sorry. So they were given all they needed, and then from that point on, they were able to get to Rome. 3 months later, and we already mentioned, they joined another Alexandrian ship, the one with the figurehead of the two twin, and they were able to make it to Rome. And so that's kind of where we'll stop tonight. We'll be moving into talking about Rome itself on Sunday. But that gives me 4 minutes, 3.5 minutes to tell you my story. So second scariest moment of my life, we had taken a crew of workers, Alabama camp, back when it used to be on Lake Martin. Down on Lake Martin, there's a suicide cliff, I think is what the locals call it. But it's a 75-foot cliff that you can jump off of into the water. Fantastic, lots of fun. It hurts every single time you slam into the water, but I love it, and I used to love doing it. So I'd taken a crew of workers, not campers, but college-age workers from camp over to that cliff. Do you remember this? So, all right, so you've heard about it, yeah. So this was my bad camp moment. I was not allowed to jump this year because we had a 1-year-old, and my wife made me guarantee that I would not jump. So I did not jump this year. I was the designated driver for the day. We went out there, drove them out there. There was probably about 8 of us on just a regular old speedboat, and they had all jumped out, and I was just out there in the water waiting, and they had climbed up, and there was, I think, 3 or 4 of them left up on top of the cliff. Well, this cliff, 75 feet tall, it's pretty thin on an island in the middle, so it couldn't really see past it until I heard thunder. And so then I kind of scooted the boat over a little bit and to see around the island, and there was this massive storm coming up really fast, lightning just all over the place. And so I yelled up, "Y'all need to come down now. We got to get back to the camp." So quickest way down was to jump real fast. So the first guy jumped, landed. Second guy jumped, landed. The last person was a girl named Anna. She jumped, landed in a sitting position on the water, shattered her back in 2 places. I knew when she hit the water, she was hurt bad. So I had the boat cranked up. I went over to her real fast. We slid her out of the water, laid her in the bottom of the boat. She's screaming because she hurt so bad. The storm has come up, and we're having to get this boat back toward the camp. Well, it's about a 25-minute boat ride in normal weather. This boat was almost vertical, trying to get through some of these waves, and this girl's laying in the bottom of a boat with, we don't know this yet, but a broken back. So we make it about halfway back to a marina, and then we're able to get her out of the boat in the storm and carry her, several of us guys carry her in and lay her on the bottom of on the floor of the marina and call the ambulance and get her to the hospital. Of course, we can't get anybody at the campground because this is back in 15 years ago, so cell phones were still not in real wide use, especially at camp. And so it took us probably about 45 minutes to get the ambulance there and to have parents meet us at the hospital, and it was a mess. But that little probably 25-minute trip across the water, bouncing across those waves with a hurt girl in the bottom of the boat, second scariest moment of my life. So the idea of being out for days in that, not knowing if your ship's going to turn over, not knowing how to survive, not knowing if it's going to come apart, thinking everybody's going to die, it is frightening. And it's wow. So yeah, I'm glad Paul made it. So all right.